We're now going to have a look at another market structure, the one called monopolistic competition. Let's start by reviewing the characteristics of such a market. A key idea here is that the individual firms in this market are selling different products. So when we say that the products are different, the term that's used is that they're differentiated. So they have some different characteristics. Could be physical characteristics of the product itself, or it could be their location, the location of the seller, or it could be a combination of the two things. Okay, I'm going to start this again. So it's a little... Let's have a look at the market structure called monopolistic competition. I've already reviewed its basic characteristics, but let's have a closer look. Key idea here is that firms in this kind of market are selling what are termed differentiated products. In other words, the products that are being sold, the goods or services, have different characteristics in some way. It could be the physical characteristics of the products themselves, or it could be even the location of the seller. Kind of examples I'm thinking of are things like restaurants, or hairdressers, or barbers, or massage therapists. You could think of clothing retailers, or coffee shops, convenience stores, other kinds of retail outlets. So they're selling possibly differentiated products in that, let's say, restaurants have different menus and are selling different kinds of food and so on. But they're also in different locations, which can be important. Another characteristic of this kind of market is that it's fairly easy for new firms to come and go from the market. So you might think of this as a situation in which huge investments are not required to enter the market and start selling a product. We are typically going to continue to assume that buyers and sellers have good information. In this case, about who is selling what, where, and the nature of the products that are on offer. One of the characteristics, or I guess one of the things that follows from the assumption that it's fairly easy to come and go from the market, is that any situation in which firms in the market are enjoying very high profits, that's going to act as an incentive, as a signal, if you like, for new firms to enter the market. So the idea of high profits, we think of something like normal profits as being what people could expect if they invest in a business. If there are above normal profits, that's going to entice new firms to enter the market, where if profits are very low, or if there are losses, that's going to lead firms to leave. So in a situation like monopoly, for example, above normal profits could last for a long time because there are very high barriers to entry. Here we assume that there are low barriers. So that's going to lead to a different conclusion. The basic conclusion is that profits are eventually going to move to normal levels. We'll come back to this in a couple of minutes, but basically the idea is that firms will enter or leave the market until there's really no more incentive to either move in or move out. Well, where did this theory come from? Weirdly enough, perhaps, it originated in two books that were published in 1933. Joan Robinson, seen on the left, and Edward Chamberlain were the authors of these books. And as far as I know, they kind of came upon this theory independently. It's perhaps one of those situations where people were thinking about, everybody was sort of thinking about the same problem at the same time. By the early 1930s, the only economic models that were around were the competitive model and the model of monopoly. But people were realizing that those were kind of extreme cases, and that what was needed was to describe markets more realistically. So this is an attempt to do that. In terms of the basic theory of setting a profit maximizing price and so on, there's really nothing new here. This is just another kind of market structure where firms have some market power. However, unlike a monopoly, firms in a monopolistically competitive market have competitors who are selling not perfect substitutes for their product, but at least relatively close substitutes. The monopolist, of course, doesn't have any close substitutes for his product. Maybe just a word about the term itself, monopolistic competition. The competition part comes from the idea that we've got many firms, and also that the firms can enter or leave the market fairly easily. The monopolistic part comes from the fact that we can simply illustrate the firm's situation with a diagram that looks like monopoly. In other words, the firm has market power. It can choose its own price. Let's think about the situation of entry and exit from the market. Suppose that this is a picture that describes the situation facing an individual firm in a monopolistically competitive industry. So we've got our usual picture of demand and the marginal revenue that comes from that. I haven't bothered putting in information about costs. Not really important here. Basically, what I want to illustrate is this situation here, where if firms in this market find themselves with above normal profits, then that's going to encourage the entry of new firms. So it's easy to imagine that if, for example, if we're imagining restaurants in a city or something like that, and new restaurants enter the market, then that's going to take away some of the customers that each individual firm has. So the demand facing each individual firm is going to decline. So I've drawn a case where there's quite a sharp decline in demand for this particular firm. Well, the basic argument, as I mentioned earlier, is that firms are going to enter and demand for existing firms is going to shrink in the way that I've illustrated here, as long as profits are abnormally high. And that process is going to come to a halt once profits have come down to normal levels. What could we say about this kind of a market in terms of whether the outcome is efficient or not? It turns out that this question doesn't really have much meaning. We could make an argument that a monopolistically competitive firm really just looks like a little monopoly. It's got its own demand, it sets a profit maximizing price, and we could make an argument like was in the textbook regarding monopoly. We could say it produces at an inefficient level. I made an argument earlier that that was not very convincing, and it's not terribly convincing here either. But an additional point that needs to be raised when we're thinking about monopolistic competition is that we've got a lot of firms producing different products. And that variety of products that buyers get to choose from is valuable in itself. And if you think back to the simplistic competitive market, the perfectly competitive market, there we had a whole bunch of firms producing identical products. So there was no product variety. And obviously people enjoy having a variety of things to choose from. And as I mentioned here, monopolistic competition also allows for the possibility of innovation, although in many cases we might imagine that these are relatively small firms, so we're not talking major research and development. So the conclusion here is that we can't really say anything one way or the other in terms of whether the outcome in a monopolistically competitive market is efficient or inefficient. All we can do is say something about the properties of this market, and we can come up with some prediction about what profits are going to be like in the long term. Now let's turn to consider the most complex market structure of all, oligopoly.